But as the historian Stephen Payne points out, wildfire has had a presence on Earth since the Devonian period, 400 million years ago, when sufficient oxygen for combustion flooded the planet's atmosphere. Once humans mastered fire, they wielded it liberally for their own purposes. They used it while hunting to herd, confuse, and entrap their prey. They used it for farming, to clear the land of cover and fertilize the soil for cultivation. They used it in tandem with domestic livestock to jumpstart regrowth on previously grazed grass. They even used it for gathering purposes, aware that light burning made way for acorns, wild raspberries, and other food sources. Sometimes their fires escaped and burned over areas larger than intended. The combination of lightning, kindled wildfire, and human burning created a crazy quilt of flamed land. So the landscapes gathered under the newly born American Forest Reserve had long been the site of a complex fire regime. With the coming of the European civilization, fire's presence only intensified. Yeoman farmers practiced slash and burn agriculture, dumping brush and grass back into the soil as ash and breaking up thick root systems in preparation for seeding with grain crops. Railroads threw sparks from their tracks and embers from their coal-fired engines, showering whole corridors of the West with fire. Loggers torched their leftover sash. Drifters, settlers, and prospectors lit fires by design and by accident. Campfires escaped. Mining towns burned into the surrounding hills. To the early progressive foresters, all this fire on the land showed a promiscuous disregard for the nation's timber resources. Bernard Furneaux, Pinchot's predecessor in the division of forestry, considered this flowering of fire a result of bad habits and loose morals. The question of forest fires, like the question of slavery, may be shelved for a time, at enormous cost in the end, but sooner or later it must be faced. On an inspection of Arizona forest in 1900, Pinchot rode horseback along the Mongolian Rim, overlooking North America's largest continuous stand of ponderosa pine. We looked down and across the forest to the plain, he later wrote in his memoirs. And as we looked, there rose a line of smoke. An Apache was getting ready to hunt deer, and he was setting the woods on fire because a hunter has a better chance under cover of smoke. It was primeval, but according to the rules, it didn't occur to him that what was primeval and what was the rule might be one and the same for good reason. The Great Fire debate commenced sooner even than Pinchot had anticipated. In the summer of 1910, 5 years after Roosevelt had created the Forest Service, and a mere 3 years after he and Pinchot had added an additional 16 million acres to the national forests, in a sweeping exercise of executive power, fires broke out all over the country, from New York to Oregon. The worst fires flared in the northern Rockies, in the National Forest of Montana and Idaho. Nearly 3 million acres burned, and that doesn't count fires in the surrounding national parks and Indian reservations, much less on private holdings or state-owned land. 79 firefighters died fighting the biggest blazes. Whole towns collapsed in flame. Some estimates put the total burned acreage for the year in the tens of millions nationwide. Three main arguments dominated the debate that followed. Some claimed the answer lay in the light burning, the Indian way. It was sometimes called. In an article published in Sunset Magazine, the month the Great Fires blew up, 3 civil engineers made the case for how fire must be fought with fire. They pointed out that California's pine forest had been burned by natives for centuries before the white man arrived, and what white men found were healthy forests with open grassy understory and accessible timber. By continuing such practices, foresters would make fire their servant rather than their master. Lighting fires when conditions were favorable in the cooler, damper weather of autumn rather than fighting fires in the searing heat and swirling winds of summer. Preemptive use of fire would protect against the kind of blowups just then charring the northern Rockies. For those who oppose federal control of the forest, catastrophic fires reinforced their belief that settlement was the only appropriate response. Development would reduce fire danger by threading the forests with roads, chopping the vast stretches of continuous fuel into more manageable chunks, by opening the timber to cutting, which would further starve fire of fuel, by populating the mountains with settlers who would organize themselves to fight fire when it occurred. To the pro-development forces, and they included many powerful Western congressmen, the enemy to be feared wasn't fire, it was conservation. Senator Weldon Hayburn of Idaho claimed the big fires were God's revenge for not allowing industry to have its way on the land. He pushed a plan to remove the burned areas from national forests and handed them over to private owners. The Idaho press went so far as to suggest clear-cutting the northern Rockies as a defensive measure. It would really be better to cut down all the trees than to incur the imminent risk of such vast destruction and mortality as has been accompanied by these fires. For it is better to devastate forests than to devastate settlements. Pinchot and the Forest Service pushed back. They viewed such arguments as a means of undermining public confidence in the agency, which still faced opposition in Congress and an annual battle for appropriations. To usher in settlement or approve wholesale clear-cutting would defeat the very purpose of the national forest. To admit the efficiency of light burning would be to capitulate to primitivism, confusing the public. The Forest Service existed to preserve the public good, and fire destroyed the public good. What was required in Pinchot's reckoning was a military-style assault on fire. 79 men had died in Idaho and Montana, not for misguided cause. They died because obstructionists in Congress hadn't provided them with adequate resources, with a system of trails, telephone lines, and lookout towers in the national forest, plus the promise of emergency appropriations to cover firefighters' costs. Early detection and rapid response would give firefighters a decisive advantage. Fire could be banished, regulated to the history books. This argument won the day, prevailing for 60 years. It had the virtue of simplicity. All fire in all forests was evil and must be stopped. It reassured the public that the men who perished in the big blow-up had not died in vain. In fact, they were the first martyrs in the noble crusade. With the trauma of 1910 seared in its DNA, the fledgling Forest Service had a defining purpose around which to rally. Dissenting voices would be marginalized for decades to come as the agency deployed its shock troops throughout the West. It waged its ruthless war on fire. The fact that roads, trails, telephones, and towers constituted their own form of development did not trouble the sleep of Pinchot. He had always said that the first great fact about conservation is that it stands for development. To him, there were two kinds of development: the kind that destroyed the forest for short-term private gain, and the kind that preserved them for the long run. Fighting fire would preserve them for the long run. Decades would pass before the folly of this approach was finally acknowledged. Trails, phones, and towers would be supplemented with tankers, helicopters, bulldozers, and the cost of fighting fires eventually would run beyond $1 billion a year.